This is not a me award. This is an us award. Give me a second. I still have men missing in action. Of course, one of them is my uncle from Korea, and two of them were with me on that Firebase. One mine personally in my command, one is another soldier that was with MACV. This thing comes at a price, a high price. And 51 years ago, not 50, well 52 years ago actually, 50 years ago I was just doing a branch transfer from field artillery to medical service corps at Triple Army Medical Center. But 52 years ago I was pretty much sitting where you were. Finally got my branch assignment for those in the Army. They do the same thing in the Navy. The Marines all go infantry first, and then they do something else. For the rest of us, we get branch assignment, and I didn't know what the heck field artillery meant, except it was my first choice. I mean, they told us, pick combat arms, pick combat arms. Your third choice is what you really want to do. You never get your third choice. I mean, that's the game. I figured field artillery was probably going to be where they would send me anyway with my math background and engineering failures. No, I are not an engineer. And then probably the most lucky streak that I can think of started at Fort Sill and Officer Basic. Not so much that it was Officer Basic School, that was easy. The next assignment was waiting for my orders and my plane ticket to Europe. And we were attached to the field artillery school, and we got to do whatever detail the major wanted a second lieutenant to do. We had to pick up colonels and generals and make sure they got their shots and got to where they needed their briefings, and then put them on the airplane and say, enjoy the tour, sir. Because they were on individual replacement. They had to go through artillery to get briefed on what artillery was going to do and all the toys that were coming down. And one of those colonels had me sit in on some of the briefings. So I had about 3 extra hours of briefings that only senior leaders got. One of them happened to be on an integrated observation system. It was at that time still being prototyped and was not yet in the field. I never expected to see it again. Especially since I was on orders to Germany and the pipeline was shutting down. Maybe we would get to spend the entire ROTC active duty time in Germany, in Nuremberg, at Pender Barracks. Next step would be arrival at Pender Barracks. You walk in to the provost marshal's office, drop your bags. The captain says, welcome aboard. I'm your sponsor. Pick up the piece of paper. Division Artillery Commander wants to talk to you. He talks to all of his second lieutenants when they report. Read the citation. Of course, it's Pender Barracks. John J. Pender, Jr. of McKeesport, Pennsylvania. Date of action, June 6, 1944, Kovel-Sumer. You saw him in Saving Private Ryan. He was the RTO on the beach that had gone back into the water 3 times to put a working radio together so they could talk to the Navy destroyers that were providing support. You probably also saw 2 or 3 other actions in that movie that you didn't even know that they were being fit in. But that's the way Spielberg works. And so as you walk across the parade ground, you have to read that, remember it, because you know the colonel is going to quiz you on it and test you to see how much you picked up, how fast you read, how fast you remember. And then, of course, the final dagger is, why do you think I wanted you to read it? Well, at that time, 4th Armored Division was on the front line in Europe, and when the balloon went up, 4th Division was on Omaha Beach, and we would be defending. At least that was my answer, my guess. I was right. And then he said, what do you want to do in headquarters? And it was December 30th. New Year's Day was coming, and that was a weekend. I didn't know where he was going to put me in Division Artillery in the whole 4th Armored Division. I didn't know where I was going. It only said, report to Division Artillery Headquarters. That was the limit of my orders. So I asked to go to the meteorology section, look at what the weatherman does. Because in artillery, you need to know what the weather is doing. And that was probably the best staff position that I stood a chance as a 2nd lieutenant getting anyway. And their W04 sized me up. Chief Street, Mr. Street actually, we called him Herr Strauss. After all, it was Germany. Worked with me for 2 days to learn division meteorology. Actually, they just used the German radios to get their weather forecast for everybody. The only time they flew a Met was when they had to fly one for when there was actual shooting going up at Grafenwehr or Hohenfels. Most of the time, they weren't doing the job that they said they were doing. They were doing something else. And then the following Monday, the best next thing happened to me. I became XO of A Battery, 1st of the 22nd. And I was the only lieutenant in that battery. And for the next 6 months, I was force-fed on how to learn to be a lieutenant in the field artillery and on post. Couldn't have asked for a better assignment in terms of preparation. And we were all rookies in our first year or second year in the command positions, including the battalion commander. The only one that wasn't a rookie was Chief Division Artillery Commander, and he was not promotable, and he knew it, and he said so. His job was to teach us. Of course, being the only lieutenant in a battery, and all the batteries only had 2 officers. We had 13 officers for a regular consignment of 33 on a TO&E. Meant I did a lot of officer of the day. Again, the luckiest thing that can happen to you. You get to practice taking over a unit. The first one, of course, I leaned heavily on the sergeant. And he taught me how to be officer of the day. Eventually, you become independent of that, and they don't sign you an experienced sergeant to be your sergeant of the guard. They give you the rookie, and then you find out if you've really learned. But in retrospect, that was probably one of the best duty assignments you can get. Pain in the rear end at the time, because it meant you were OD twice a week, and weekend rosters were a separate roster. You could be OD 3 times in a week. Not much time spent at the bar with Das Gute Zierendorfer, which was unpasteurized beer. It doesn't get any better than that. The brewery was outside of town. It was in Zurndorf. Took a while to get used to it. Our Budweiser 3.2 Weasel does not prepare you for unpasteurized beer. Yeah, for those of you that have been there, yeah, you'll get it. But once you taste beer as it's supposed to be actually tasted and drunk, it doesn't get any better than Zurndorfer. I'll fast forward because to Vietnam. And there, that was a completely different environment. Surprise, surprise. Yes, the division artillery commander interviewed me, and he was promotable. You can detect the difference almost the minute you walk in the door between the 06 that is promotable and the 06 that isn't. But the duty assignment was at Waite Davis. We had no reinforcing artillery. It was an engineer camp. The captain commanding the camp was class of 68, a West Pointer. I'm class of 69, and I'm older than he is because I flunked out in engineering school. And he was overmatched for the job. In those days, it was 1 year to first lieutenant, 1 year to captain. And somehow in 2 years, you were supposed to have the experience of 4 or 5 years as being a lieutenant. Doesn't really work that way. When you get to be captain that quick, you're overmatched. Of course, that wasn't the first time that I saw that. Practically every battery commander in Europe was a first lieutenant. And those that were captains were overmatched. So you learned how to work with a superior officer that was overmatched and not ready for the position that he was in. I'll take the second position any day of the week over the first. And when I asked to go to his first briefing, it'll be a breath of fresh air to have an artilleryman there. That did not compute. And I noticed that there were some Air Force reefers, and I asked what was that, and they said, well, that's our counter-mortar battery unit. That's air defense, not field artillery. I was field artillery. Said, who's running that? Said, some warrant officer named Mr. Street. Like I say, I couldn't have asked for a better assignment, and particularly knowing that I had somebody that knew me from Germany. Of course, he was still in Germany when I left Germany. And I asked him, how did you beat me here? And I didn't want to take 30 days and waste my leave time. I just wanted to get here and get it over with. And like I said, I was a first lieutenant all of 13 months after entering active duty, and I was senior. And I was expected to provide leadership not only to my platoon, but maybe make some headway with those air defense guys, the twin 40s that were there. Mr. Street was easy because he knew me. I did what he said. Anyway, the sergeants down on the dusters were also quite independent. They didn't like officers. They didn't have one. And needless to say, a first lieutenant had to make friends, had to do favors. I got their mail. They weren't getting it through their own system. I had my battalion commander get me their mail, and I hand delivered it to the sergeant. And then, and only then, would he talk to me. You have to earn their respect and their trust before they'll take your lead. And for the first couple of months there at Wake Davis, there was no way in hell those duster sergeants were going to follow my lead. I had to earn their respect, do something for them. Actually, the best thing I did for them, I could point out targets for them. They just were sitting on the perimeter, had a sector to cover, and which they could, and they would do it very well. You don't want to attack a duster. But they really didn't have any other targets to shoot at, or what did you really want to get maximum use out of that in the defense? And there were some very specific observation posts that they could hit that nobody else could. Once you pointed it out to them and they had a specific target during the wild minutes, they practiced on it. So there was some semblance of tactical competence that I could demonstrate, and then the administrative support. I asked for a staff assignment. I'm ROTC. I've got 2 years. I needed the command time. If I'm going to be useful to the Army, I need to know how the staff works. So I asked for staff assignment at the headquarters. Got it. And one day the major handed me a manual and said, "What do you know about the integrated observation system?" And I told him, I've had 1 hour of briefing at Fort Sill. Had no idea what they were talking about because this was something that was being prototyped. And he said, "Well, Lieutenant, you know more about that system than all the officers combined in this battalion. It's your section. Read it, come back and tell me in the morning what you need." And so we formed up an integrated observation system with the resources that we had in a general support artillery battalion. General support artillery battalion does not have FOs. They do not have recon sergeants. They do not have forward observers. Direct support has those assets. I became going to be an independent command. You jump at it. All I asked for were a good NCO that could work outside the wire, because general artillery support is inside the wire almost exclusively. And we were going to be stationed outside the wire. We didn't know where, but it wasn't going to be at Artillery Hill in Pleiku, that was for sure. And I need soldiers that know how to do maintenance on generators and who can learn. And those were my requirements that I asked of that battalion. I didn't have anybody in mind particularly. It was just, this is a new toy. I need people who want to learn the new toy. And for 2 weeks, that's what we did. Everybody had to learn everything. And being a lieutenant, you had to know everything because you had to teach them. How to do radio, how to do maintenance, how to put it together, how to take it apart. Had to set up rotating shifts for duty so that we could always observe. Sergeant knew how to do that. It was a piece of cake. Counter-rotating duty roster is just like officer of the day. 4 hours on, we set it up so you were on a noon, 4, and 8 shift, or a 2, 6, and 10 shift. And I took a shift. so did Chuck, our NCO. It meant every 2 days we got 2 hours on with everybody, and Chuck and I got 2 hours every 2 days by ourselves where we could talk about what's going on. And that's how we built our team rapport. It's how we got really tight that way, is what happens. And then we began practicing. We deployed a couple, 2, 3 different places before they sent us up to Firebase 6. Firebase 6 was a very familiar fire base to 1st Battalion, 92nd Artillery. They used to have a battery up there. Can only be resupplied by helicopter. If you read Sun Tzu, it's a terrible place to have a position. Because you can defend it so easily, it means you can be isolated so easily. Sun Tzu will tell you the perfectly defended position is a trap. You can't get out, is the way I think was the translation that I remember. And that's what we were in. If you left the wire at Firebase 6, you were in Indian country, enemy territory. And that's exactly the way the North Vietnamese thought of that Rocket Ridge and that whole mountain range and that whole area. It was their forward operating area. And they were stockpiling it with material so that when we left and we were on the way out, they would be forward positioned to continue their invasion and eventually capturing of South Vietnam. We were in their front yard. The real story begins on March 30th. Some dumb lieutenant wanted to go down to the spring for fresh water. Dai Wei allowed that lieutenant to go down to get the fresh water. But he sent one of his men, with me. We got down to the spring. It was the second time I'd visited it. We all knew where it was. No fresh water, you last about 2 days on a fire base, if you're lucky. If the resupply helicopters don't come in with water, you get very thirsty very quick. So knowing where the spring was and getting fresh water, it was standard water detail. And we found a watering station, freshly built. The bamboo was still weeping. On the way back up the hill, we stopped to catch our breath, and there was a half-dug automatic weapon position. Major axis was right on our antennas. And then we got back up and reported what we saw, and it's like, In Europe, we went to the assembly point once a month, and it was always a day or two before payday. Can't imagine what's going to happen tomorrow. Just put yourself in the enemy commander's shoes. Only question is he going to attack the day before payday, or are they going to attack on payday? Going to be one or the other. We prepared as best we could. The Vardy commander walked in and said, "What do you need?" Flew in. He didn't walk in. He said, "I need 2 platoons of American infantry." He said, "I don't have 2 platoons of American infantry." He said, "I know that, but that's what you asked." It's how you tell him who your attachments are, who your enemy is, what your situation is. I'm naked. I'm only as good as the South Vietnamese artillery battery commander's men are, because he doesn't trust his infantry protection. He thinks they'll go over to the other side and chew hoy the other way at first shot. We prepared to do infantry. Not a whole lot you can do with artillery to defend that position. And next morning the attack came. We were not surprised. Surprised at the hour that they did it, but we were not surprised. They came 15 minutes early. You know, Chuck was on duty. He took the graveyard shift. His job was to wake us up. And it was wake us up before the sun hits the top of the hill. As he was on his way down to wake us up, the first mortar came in. We almost had it right. But at least we were prepared that we knew it was going to come at that hour of the morning. And we started the defense of Firebase 6. In less than an hour, Chuck was dead. Randy was dead. Phil was taken prisoner. Mike, our short timer, I had the colonel fly out the day before for an in-country R&R. He survived, but he's a basket case. And I was left with Pat and myself. Craig and Jim were the 4 Americans left on the Firebase with Daiwi and his artillery battery. We did not have any infantry after the first hour. We were able to maintain a perimeter and maintain cohesiveness. We got pushed around, but we got pushed as a unit. We were not going to be able to survive the night. Both Daiwi and I came to that conclusion. Little lull in the fighting as the enemy was resupplying and taking its last glass of water before the final attack. And that's when we decided to evacuate, and my job as artilleryman was to put artillery fire, blocking fire, on that Firebase and get away from it as much as we could. That mission was successful. I became a straggler at that point. I was the rear, the last person off the Firebase. The person that was before me was a South Vietnamese machine gunner. And he went down the trail to set up cover fire for me, and I was supposed to catch up with him, and I never did. And, and that's the first day of the action that brought this thing. The next 8 days is another story. Not much to that one. I found a bamboo thicket out of necessity the next day. My plan was to be in no man's land and stay in no man's land because I expected the Firebase to be retaken or abandoned completely within a couple days. I just had to wait a couple days. And the plan was to stay in no man's land. I got a little bit too close to the far edge. And I was in their lines. That's where I was hiding. So I wasn't going to move whether I wanted to or not. And after 8 days, they took attrition. They fell into a rhythm. You time your escape to when they're having breakfast after being awake all night on duty, and just get farther into no man's land. All you got to do is move 25 meters, and as long as they don't chase you, take your time. Came in, I think it was the next day before I was medevaced. Got to spend one more night on Firebase 6. They did not let us go without a fight. I have to thank those helicopter pilots for extracting me. They were under fire. But I think my conclusion is that the North Vietnamese had one mortar tube up. And so they put one up, it goes boom, and then they drop the next one. So you've got about 60 seconds to, after splash, get your helicopter in, pick up some dumbass lieutenant, get out of there. And that's the way I was extracted, very much under fire. Just to close out the story, the aircraft commander of that helicopter was Bill Adams, company commander of that aviation company. And, you say, permission to come aboard, sir. Granted. And I found out later he always flew the dangerous missions with his pilots. He may be aircraft commander, but he flew in with them. 6 weeks later, Bill Adams tried to do the same thing up at Firebase 5, and they bought the farm. He is a posthumous recipient of this thing. And that kind of is front to end of the whole story.